What is a church? For many years, particularly in America, Christians have not thought so much about what a church is, but have thought more about what a church should do. They've thought about what churches can do in the sense of how Christians can gather their resources and manpower together and can address certain issues, whether that be addressing certain social causes or concerns, whether that be providing good teaching on the Bible or doctrine, or whether that's creating a sense of community and belonging for people. Churches can do great things, and it is good for us to think about those things. But when we forget to think about what a church is, well, then a cart can get in front of a horse and we can actually be subtly misled. And I think that can be easily proven to be taking place in the American movement of church simply by a confusion between what a church is and what all other things Christians do are. So let me read to you a quote from the conservative Roman Catholic writer Ross Douthat in his book, Bad Religion: How Our Country Became a Nation of Heretics. The emphasis on parachurch ministries within evangelicalism increased cooperation across denominations. But once unleashed, the para mentality was difficult to contain, and among too many believers, it eventually threatened to supplant the idea of an institutional church entirely. The turn boded ill for evangelicalism's long-term future, because although the paragroups were immensely successful at religious mobilization, they weren't as effective at sustaining commitment across a lifespan or across generations. They were institutions for an anti-institutional faith, you might say, which meant that they were organized around personalities and causes and rarely created the sense of comprehensive intergenerational community. You couldn't spend your whole life in Campus Crusade for Christ, or raise your daughters as a promise keeper, or count on groups like the Moral Majority of the Christian Coalition to sustain your belief system beyond the next election cycle. For that kind of staying power, you needed a confessional tradition, a church, an institution capable of outlasting its charismatic founders. My prayer for what we're going to do with this lesson today is we're going to see what that institutional reality is, the church, and how it outlasts all charismatic leaders, all pet projects, all causes and concerns, but will itself last until the final day, the institution which Jesus promised the gates of hell itself would not conquer. So we will look at Jesus' teaching from the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to look at 3 chapters in particular: Matthew 16, Matthew 18, and Matthew 28. But we're going to take those in reverse order, starting with Matthew 28. And the question that we're going to be asking throughout each of these chapters is, who gets to represent Jesus? So let's read the Great Commission from Matthew 28. Verses 18 through 20. Jesus says to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Well, here we get the church's marching orders. This is the Great Commission, the final words that Matthew records for us that Jesus is imparting to his disciples before he ascends into heaven. And here he tells us that because all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to him, we now go to the nations. And our charge is to make disciples of them. In the same way that Jesus came to the earth and made the 12 his disciples, so too now the 12 are to go and to make disciples, and we now are here today, downstream from that mission. And we too are caught up in that mission and must continue to go and make disciples. But how do we do that? Well, fortunately, Jesus tells us how. We are to baptize them into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and we are to teach them to observe all that Jesus taught. So let's just think about those two things. What does it mean to be baptized into the triune name of God? Well, all throughout the Bible, those who bear God's name are those who are in a covenant with God. To bear God's name means that you represent Him. And to represent God means that you have a covenant relationship with God. So now, on this side of Jesus' coming, those who are in covenant relationship with God are those who are inheritors of the new covenant, which we read about in Jeremiah 31. Those who are members of the new covenant are those who have had their sins forgiven, have had God's law written on their heart, and those who have been filled with the Holy Spirit. Those who are in a covenant relationship with God. So when we are baptizing someone into the name of God, we are saying this person is a member of the new covenant. We are making a declaration. But notice, consider, you do not baptize yourself. To be baptized is not an individual event. It assumes that there is at least another person. There is a community around you who hears your testimony, who sees your life, and who says, that looks like someone who has God's law written on their heart. That looks like someone filled with the Holy Spirit. This looks like someone who believes that their sins are forgiven. And so it is inherently communal. So this means that there must be a community of some kind who has the authority to authenticate, to recognize those who are in a covenant relationship with God, and who also have the authority to teach them everything that Jesus has commanded. Who is that community? Well, I'm going to keep teaching, try to make this clear, but let me just jump to the chase. That is the church. The church is the earthly institution who has been given the authority to speak on behalf of heaven, to recognize new covenant members, to teach in the name of Christ. Let's now go back and let's see Jesus' teaching, the clearest teaching he has about this earthly institution, speaking on behalf of heaven, the church. So there are two places in all four Gospels where Jesus uses the word church. And those two places are in Matthew 18 and Matthew 16. So let's go to Matthew 18. Let me read verses 15 through 17. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Okay, the situation that Jesus is describing here is that there is an individual who has a sin, an unrepentant sin, a persistently unrepentant sin in their life that is now contradicting their profession of faith. We recognize that all Christians still wrestle with sin, but Jesus here assumes that those who are in the new covenant, those who are in relationship with him, are those who do not persist in unrepentant sin. And so Jesus creates a structure. Those who are walking in sin should be confronted by an individual, then should be confronted by 2 to 3 individuals. And if at that point the brother is still persisting in unrepentant sin, then that brother should be confronted by the church, the entire church. And the word for church just simply means congregation. The word church doesn't mean pastor, it doesn't mean elder, it doesn't mean deacon, it doesn't mean small group leader. It means the whole assembly. Here we see that the final court of authority is the church. If he even doesn't listen to the church, then let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. The Gentile and a tax collector there is simply referring to someone who is outside of the covenant community of God. Jesus is accommodating to language that his original hearers would have easily recognized. They would have easily assumed right away that Gentiles and tax collectors, they're not in covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so, Jesus is here saying, this individual, if they persist, if their manner of life is undermining their profession of faith, then at that point, you, church, have the authority to treat them as if they are not in a covenant relationship with God. Or to put it more simply, you have the authority to say that this person, according to your judgment, no longer has a credible profession of faith, no longer has a credible reason to call themselves a Christian. Which is a pretty audacious thing to do, right? Where does anyone get the authority to do something like that? Well, that's exactly what Jesus talks about in the next 3 verses. Look at Matthew 18 through 20. And these passages typically are interpreted disconnected from what Jesus just said, but we must see them flowing from exactly what Jesus just told us about the community of the church and its membership, its inclusion, those who are in or those who are out. We must see that directly flowing into Jesus' teaching here in Matthew 18 through 20. Here Jesus says, "Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." Here, we see that the church has been given a unique authority, an authority to bind and loosen. If that sounds strange to you, then consider this verse, this eye-popping verse from John 20, verse 23, where Jesus tells his apostles, "If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld." Here, I think this is John's version of what Matthew is saying here, that the church possesses a unique authority. Now, lest I lead you into confusion in any way, I do not believe that this says the church possesses ontologically the ability to make someone a Christian or not, or the church possesses the ability to forgive sins or not. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think the rest of the New Testament is abundantly clear that Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone provides the forgiveness of sins, and that we all, by virtue of our connection with Jesus, have now been made priests with God. And so we don't need to go through an earthly priest or earthly institution to arrive at the means of forgiveness. Those come directly through us. But I do think that Jesus is teaching here abundantly clearly that there is real authority to recognize, to authenticate whether or not someone has received the forgiveness of sins, has received the Holy Spirit, has the law of God written on their heart, has become a member of the new covenant. Okay, what does it mean to bind and to loose? Well, there's lots of different interpretations about what Jesus is referring to here specifically with that image of binding and loosening. But I think a simple way of thinking about this, and rather than going through the variety of different interpretations, I'll just tell you what I think is accurate. I think here that he's referring to what is a correct interpretation and what is an incorrect interpretation, or rather saying when you look at someone in their life, can you rightly identify evidences that are available to you and then say this person is someone who is in the covenant with God? Or you look at someone's life and you see the failure of those evidences and then say this person is no longer someone who should be treated like they're in covenant with God. Someone who is bound in to the covenant community and someone who is loosened from that covenant community. Now, importantly here, just to again underline this, you can't see this in English, but in Greek, in verse 18, when Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven," all of the yous in that sentence are plural. So we could translate that as, "Whatever you all bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you all loose on earth." And the last group of people that Jesus spoke to previously was the church itself. So here we see that it is the congregation, the assembly, who possesses this binding and loosening authority. And that interpretation is strengthened by what he says in the next verse. Look at verse 19 once more. Jesus says, "Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven." Now, okay, just to draw your attention, the reason why we know that Jesus is still talking about this idea of church discipline and authenticating and identifying those who are in relationship with him is simply because he begins the sentence with "again." Again, I say to you. And notice that he again brings up the dichotomy of earth and heaven. In verse 18, we were told that whatever the church binds on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever it looses on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And here in verse 19, he says, if two of you agree on earth, it will be done by my Father in heaven. Jesus is speaking about an earthly institution that speaks on behalf of heaven. That's what he's referring to here. So binding and loosening has to do with multiple people. The reason why I think we're told two here is because two is the smallest number of people that you could have in a church. You cannot be a church by yourself, but you do not need to be a church of 50 people or 100 or 3,000 to be considered a church. If there are two of you on a desert island, you together can constitute a real church. Two is the smallest possible number that a church could exist. So the authority to bind and loosen requires multiple people, a minimum of two, and it requires agreement. If two of you agree on earth. And what is the agreement here referring to? I think this agreement is referring to what he just was talking about. Is this person's manner of life a credible manner that gives correct evidence to the work of the Spirit, to the forgiveness of sins, and to the law of God being written on someone's heart? Is this person a member of the new covenant? Do you agree together? If two of you agree, or rather, maybe not even agreeing on if that person's in, but also agreeing on whether that person is out. That's Jesus's example here, is the brother is walking in unrepentant sin. And if after you've gone through the steps that Jesus has laid out, if the church is convinced that this person, they're not even listening to the church, and the church then agrees, this person who was brought in should be loosed, then Jesus says, if you do agree together, then ask me. Ask my Father in heaven, and he will do this for you. So the church here is exercising its unique authority on earth to speak on behalf of heaven. But again, this is another argument to show that the earthly institution does not ontologically, in of itself, possess this authority. It does not speak and then heaven responds. Rather, they ask. They ask the Father, and then the Father is the one who is the primary agent who is acting. Binding and loosening has to do with multiple people agreeing together and asking. Now, verse 20, so that is the mechanism by which the church is doing the binding and loosening. So it is multiple people, agreement, and asking. Verse 20 provides the theological ground for why these people can do that. Read verse 20 with me again. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. So again, we know that he's talking about the same thing because he begins the sentence with for. For, so the ground, why can you, people on earth, ask my Father in heaven? Why can you do that? Because where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. So again, see that emphasis on being in the name. If you gather in his name, that isn't just some random identifier. That is, you are gathering as those who are the ones who bear God's name, those who are in covenant with him. Where 2 or 3 gather together, there's something unique that happens in the physical proximity of Christians gathering together. And that goes back to the idea of what a church is. A church is an assembly, a congregation, which requires a physical gathering together. When the church gathers together, and there's agreement, and they ask, Jesus is now present with them. Present with them in a unique way. Of course, Jesus is God. God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. Right? There's nowhere you can go away from God. That's what Psalm 139 tells us. God's everywhere. So obviously when Jesus says, there am I among them, he is there among the church in a unique way that is not like his universal presence everywhere else. It is his covenantal presence. It's similar to the way that he was present with Israel when they were traveling in the Exodus, or he was present with Israel when they were in the Promised Land, or that he was present with Israel when he came down onto the temple. There is a unique experience of God's presence that is for his people, his covenant people. And when his covenant people gather together, there is a unique presence that Jesus gives them. And that is why the church has the authority to do what it's doing in the binding and the loosening. Jesus is there. And the church agrees. And so they ask, and Jesus speaks for them. I think this is actually what Jesus is referring to in Matthew 28. In Matthew 28, when he concludes his Great Commission with, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I think what he is drawing there is that the church's mission to baptize and to teach is something that the church is going to be able to do because Jesus is present there with the church, present in a unique way that he is not present elsewhere. So the church can baptize. It can identify members of the new covenant. It can identify those who believe. The church can teach because Jesus is present there. So the church is where Jesus is present uniquely. The church is the institution that has the authority to bind and to loosen. Now, here in Matthew 18, we see that Jesus is giving the church the authority to evaluate someone's manner of life. But if we go back to Jesus' first reference to the church, in Matthew 16, we'll see that he broadens that not only to someone's manner of life, but also to their very profession of faith. And this is where we will actually see what the mechanism of authority is that grants the church the ability to bind and to loosen. So let's read Matthew 16, verses 13 through 19. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Here, Jesus asks for a correct confession. Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter gets it right. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus identifies that Peter, here on earth, has rightly reflected a heavenly reality. Flesh and blood did not reveal that to you, Peter, but my Father who is in heaven. Peter is now speaking on behalf of heaven. He is identifying Jesus as the Christ. And so Jesus proclaims that Peter becomes the rock on which the church is built. And that is our first instance of the word church in all four Gospels there. And he is given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, a symbol of authority to be exercised on behalf of heaven that binds and loosens. I'm sure you recognize that. That sounded quite familiar to you. Look at verse 19 one more time. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Here in Matthew 16, Peter alone is given the keys of the kingdom. But I think he is given the keys of the kingdom as the representative of the apostles. He is the one who spoke up, who said, "You are the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." And because Peter is the one who stands up and preaches at Pentecost, and the church is born from there, there is a way in which Peter, in a historical redemptive sense, is the rock on which the church is built. But we know that the keys of the kingdom are not restricted to Peter in some way, as if he were the first pope or something like that. Because in Matthew 18, Jesus gives the keys to the congregation themselves. So Peter is a representative of the church in Matthew 16, but in Matthew 18, we see the keys distributed to the church, which is dependent on just regular Christians gathering together in Jesus' name. But here we see that, just like in Matthew 18, what we see is that someone on earth is rightly speaking in behalf of heaven. And because Jesus identifies that in Peter, he says, "Peter, that's exactly right. You're the kind of person. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is where the keys will be exercised. This is where the church will be built. The church is going to be the earthly institution that speaks on behalf of heaven, both in the manner of life in which we live and the profession of faith in which we profess. We rightly identify who Jesus is, and our life corroborates that profession." This means the church is a gathering of at least 2 or 3 people who have been baptized into the triune name of God and agree with one another about the credibility of their life and the profession of their faith. It is a heavenly institution that dwells on earth like an embassy who hands out marks and identifiers of those who are citizens of heaven. It does not make people citizens of heaven, just like an embassy does not make anyone a citizen of a country. But like an embassy, it does authenticate passports and marks of identity to say, this is one who is a true citizen. The church is the embassy who exercises the keys of the kingdom of heaven by authenticating who is and is not a right representative of Jesus. So who gets to represent Jesus on earth? The church. The church is the mechanism by which God represents himself on the church. That is what a church is. The why of a church is Matthew 28. Matthew 28 then spills outward into what should energize and motivate a church. We are to go forward and make disciples of the nations, to baptize them and teach them to obey Jesus. So this is what should motivate and energize all churches. But what a church is a visible, earthly institution that is given concrete shape here on earth through its use of the keys of the kingdom. And just to whet your appetite for what the next lesson will be on the sacraments and its connection to what a church is, let me read one quote from Oliver O'Donovan for you. The sacraments provide the primary way in which a church is knit together. That is, given institutional form and order. Without them, the church could be a visible society, without doubt, but only a rather intangible one, melting indeterminately like a delicate mist as we stretched out our arms to embrace it. In these forms, we know where the church is, by those forms referring to baptism and the Lord's Supper. We know where the church is and can attach ourselves to it. They are at once signs of the mystery of redemption wrought in Christ and effective signs which give palpable presence in the participating church. When a church uses the keys of the kingdom to bind and loosen, that emerges here in reality through the practice, not only of bringing someone into the church through membership, but specifically through baptism and taking the Lord's Supper. But that will be something to be addressed at another time.